Hello and welcome to my movie relationship analysis video presentation in health and human relationships. I'm here to demonstrate through oral presentation of the relationship scene in the movie that I have chosen. Since we're in October, I thought it would be so much fun to choose a Halloween movie. So the movie I've got to choose is The Corpse Bride. Ready? Let's begin. Before we go ahead and go through the summary of the story, there's a couple characters that I need to talk about. Here's the board to keep it organized. Victor Van Dott is the main character of the story. He goes through so many struggles through the story and is even trapped in the land of the dead. He is a very clumsy boy and doesn't remember his vows, which gets him in trouble. He's also engaged to Victoria. Emily is the corpse bride. You'll see her a lot in the video too. She is the one that was betrayed by a lover, end up getting murdered, and falls in love with Victor when he pretends to propose. Victoria has a very quiet personality. She's the fiance of Victor, doesn't know exactly what's going on, very quiet, very confused, but is always very helpful. The last person is the villain of our story, which is Lord Barkis. He is very mischievous and is very greedy. This movie took place in the 1700s or 1800s where parents arranged marriages. It was also taking place in a European village in England or Scotland, somewhere very close and secluded. Okay, so the story begins with Victor and Victoria in the chapel reviewing their vows and getting ready for their marriage ceremony, which is just a practice. It ends up backfiring on him because he doesn't know his vows. He's feeling very clumsy. He does want to marry Victoria, but ends up dropping the candle, lighting her mom's dress on fire. He runs into the woods feeling embarrassed, and as he is walking through the woods, he tries to remember his vows. He puts a ring on a twig once he says it perfectly, and that twig becomes a hand, which is a finger, and out comes Emily, the corpse bride. Now that Victor's in the land of the dead, he ends up being super confused, doesn't know what's going on. Emily ends up telling him that you said your vows perfectly and now I'm your wife, and they're married. Anyways, Victor does not understand what's going on, but tricks Emily to take him back into the land of the living. Once we get there, he ends up telling Emily to stay put while he has some unfinished business to do, to go tell my parents that we are married. And so once he goes and does that, he ends up not going to see his parents. He goes to see Victoria and tell Victoria that he's ended up marrying a corpse bride, and Emily had enough of waiting, and so she went to go find Victor. Emily and Victoria end up seeing each other, and Victoria ends up feeling a little betrayed and takes Victor back to the land of the dead. So now that Victoria knows that her fiance, Victor, is married to a corpse bride, she gets very concerned. She ends up telling her parents that the whole situation, and even ends up going to her religious church to find the priest. She ends up getting locked in her house. Her parents think she's crazy, and Victor is still missing. Alrighty, so since Victor cannot be found, nor does anyone believe Victoria's story about seeing Victor or seeing the corpse bride, there becomes a visitor to the wedding rehearsal, and his name is Lord Barkis. And he ends up looking like a wealthy young man, and her parents decide to marry her off to Lord Barkis, since Victor is nowhere to be found, and assuming that he left her. Once Lord Barkis and Victoria are married, there ends up being tons of skeletons and mummies and all sorts of things crowding the room to go find loved ones and to head to the chapel. And in pure panic, Victoria finds out that the only reason Lord Barkis wanted to marry her is because of the money. Little does he know, she doesn't have any money, nor do her parents. So they all decide to go see what the hustle and bustle was out in the chapel, and she ends up learning that Victor is getting married to the corpse bride Emily, and everyone is there, living and dead. Now, the big part of this wedding is that Emily is dead and Victor is not. So that means Victor would have to drink from poison wine to make him undead so that they could marry, because it's unlawful. So once Victoria arrives, Victor ends up seeing her. But little does she know that Lord Barkis is right behind her and ends up snatching Victoria away. But there comes a backstory. This backstory is about Emily. Emily ends up noticing who Lord Barkis is. He ends up being the murderer of Emily and taking all of her gold. Now that Emily knows that it was Lord Barkis that took her life, Victor becomes furious. He ends up dueling Lord Barkis, and as they are fighting and dueling, he ends up taking that cup of wine, drinks it, doesn't know that it's poison, and takes his own life. Now that Lord Barkis is dead, the land of the dead can get revenge for Emily and the future things that he was going to do Victoria. Now that Emily is free from turmoil and from torment, she gives the ring back to Victor, grants them more wishes of their marriage, and she floats off to a million butterflies, and it's a happy ending. Alrighty, so I wrote down some of the major struggles and some of the victories. Some of the major struggles that happened were communication. It was such a big one. A lot of the characters did not communicate, and one that Victor was gone so long that he couldn't even tell where he was or if he still wanted to even marry Victoria. The next one was what dot are you? This is a video that we watched at TED Talk. There are so many personalities of these characters and they're all different. So that's the reason why they could never get along. The next one was the feel of defeat or giving up. Victor had a lot of obstacles in his way, and instead of pushing through them, he felt like he was defeated, and someone always had to bring him back up. Some of the victories. Helping solve Emily's case, who murdered her. That wasn't even a part of the story, but they figured it out anyways and knew it was him and stopped it before it could happen to Victoria. And the victory was finally getting to marry Victoria because he had waited so long and finally memorized his vows. Okay, so it's almost the end of my presentations, but I want to talk about how to avoid adversaries in this movie. The first one was to have such a very fast wedding when Victor obviously wasn't ready. He couldn't remember his lines and he was nervous just all the time. The next one was that since Victor was gone, couldn't be found, his Victoria's parents wanted to quickly marry her off and chose Lord Barkis when they had no idea who he was. The third one is Emily and forgiveness. At the very end of the movie, she learns to forgive Lord Barkis, what he did, and it makes me think about the conversation and discussion we had about Sarah Montana, who had a real risk of forgiveness, and one of my favorite quotes that she said was, if you don't know what happened to you, you can't know that you're forgiven, or you can't know what to forgive. So even though Emily didn't know who it was or what even had happened, she had forgave him knowing that she could be free from torment and free from him doing it to anyone else. And the last one is to tell the truth, communicate. Victor did not tell Emily what was going on inside his head, that he was scared. He didn't express his feelings, which is so important in communication, expressing your feelings and telling people how you feel. So I think definitely to avoid the adversaries and challenges in the story is communicate and let people know how you're feeling and what you can do to solve these problems. Alrighty guys, thanks!